Welcome to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. We wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of the city and the region. We'd also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's event. I'd also like to acknowledge a number of dignitaries in the room, in particular key members of the Diplomatic Corps. It shows incredible ongoing support for Ukraine. It's an absolute pleasure for ASPI to host Ukraine Ambassador Vasyl Myroshnychenko and to hold this important event. Before February, few would have predicted much Australian involvement in a European war. So far away, the main interest would have been the safety of Australians in the region and any impact on displaced people. However, Russia's illegal war on Ukraine has demonstrated that a regional crisis has global impact. What is happening in Ukraine is relevant to Australia and our Indo-Pacific region. As Japanese Prime Minister Kishida said last week at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, Ukraine today may be East Asia tomorrow. Many are looking at the similarities and differences with cross-strait tensions and what is needed to deter conflict in relation to Taiwan. Learning the lessons of the Russian war is vital, but the impact and lessons are far broader than Taiwan. They range from food security, energy security and inflation, to the need to compete and win the information war, which Ukrainian President Zelensky has excelled, to the importance of both deterrence and enforcing rules and international law, and the need for collective responses to malicious actions. Australia has joined many nations in providing military, financial and diplomatic support to Ukraine. Along with our partners, it is vital that we do not allow fatigue to set in. We must continue holding Russia accountable for the war, for breaching the UN Charter, for any war crimes and atrocities committed and violations of international humanitarian law, and we must fight for the rules that have served us so well since the end of World War II. Fatigue is natural. Lives are being lost on the ground and livelihoods are suffering not just across Europe, but around the globe due to supply chain unreliability and rising prices. But these short-term costs are outweighed by the long-term need for countries like Australia, those in the EU, and around the world to show that rules, territorial integrity, and sovereignty matter. These are all worth fighting for. If we can only collectively last for 6 months or a year, then the message to authoritarian countries will be clear. It will confirm their view that Western democratic countries are inherently weak and can simply be outlasted as they alter the international rules and standards before our very eyes. On all these issues, we'll hear first from Ambassador Myroshnychenko, who is joining us at ASPI today after recently returning from Ukraine. That will be followed by a virtual discussion moderated by ASPI Director Bec Shrimpton, with journalist Anthony Galloway joining us from Ukraine and Dr Natasha Kuhrt from the King's College London. It is great pleasure that I invite the Ambassador to the podium. Vasyl, the floor is yours.
Mr. Bussey, Justin, thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to be back at ASPI. I was here at the end of April. I totally enjoyed my experience here and I was very delighted to get an invite to come back. I do believe that this is one of the best think tanks in Australia and very happy to have this opportunity. And I'm very happy to see such a turnout. I heard that this event was sold out. I wish it was sold out for a different reason. And the reason is not because of me, it's because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and what is happening right now in Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine. Usually, since I arrived in Australia, I've traveled all over the country. I've spoken to different audiences in different cities. I visited 5 cities here and major cities. I've been to Perth and Adelaide and Brisbane and Melbourne and Sydney many times. Usually I never read my notes. I just speak from my heart. But today I'm going to make an exception. I'll still be talking to you, but my team, Ukraine, has prepared good insights that I want to share with you. And of course, we'll carry on with some Q&As later on. But I think that's important that my messages are delivered and I can convey what I want to say, because sometimes I get too emotional and then I forget what I actually wanted to say. And then I share so much, and sometimes it's just too much. But anyways, look, when crisis arises, we see nations that respond in two ways. Nations that stare at their shoes and hope they do not get asked for support or for the voice of an opinion. Nations that walk towards the problem, recognize that there is a global responsibility to act as a community of nations for the good of all. So these are two separate kinds of nations we have. Australia is a nation that walks towards problems with a clear-eyed understanding that to do otherwise is to condemn the world to be a place without principles and without values or global norms of behavior. Australia has demonstrated in very practical terms for over a century that it does not believe in a sink and swim world where it is every nation for itself and maybe the strongest nation win. Australia has supported the concept that being on the right side of history is about collective action in defense of community of nations where might does not equal right, and where rules apply equally to the weak as they do to the strong, where nations have the right to sovereignty, independence free of coercion and aggression, and where self-defense and security is a right that can be exercised through collective security agreements. We are faced with an existential challenge to those principles and values. And when I say we, I mean we, Ukraine, Australia, the EU, the UN, the world. What is happening in Ukraine is with a massive invasion from Russia and potentially Belarus, is that the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign, independent nation has been extinguished permanently. The question is, what is the world going to do? What is Australia is going to do? Which nations will stare at their shoes and hope no one calls on them to respond? And which nations will see this military invasion as an attack on the global community of nations that we set up in 1945 according to the values, rules, and not military or economic power, and then contribute to resisting it? Very few people know that Ukrainian Socialist Republic was a founding member state of the United Nations. And even during the Soviet times, Ukraine maintained a mission to the UN. Of course, we all understand it was just an extra vote for the Soviet Union, that there were only three nations picked: the Soviet Union, Ukraine, and Belarus Socialist Republics. Ukraine is defending itself against one of the largest arms and ammunition producing countries in the world. Ukraine cannot defeat Russia's invasion without being able to draw on weapons and ammunition replacement that at least matches Russia's. Ukraine needs Australia to continue to supply military and other practical support, and to work with Australia's allies and security partners like the US, NATO, to encourage greater collective action, either in defense of Ukraine or to degrade Russia's capacity to wage war, preferably both. This is an immediate necessity. And I use the word necessity very deliberately. There are wars of necessity and wars of choice. For Ukraine, this is a war of necessity. If Ukraine does not fight and win it all, it will cease to exist as a sovereign, independent nation. For Australia, Ukraine's defensive war of necessity may seem like a war of choice, where Australians have choice to be involved or not involved. My argument today is that there is nothing further from the truth. Everyone got this crisis wrong. A decade ago, no one would have predicted Russia would invade Ukraine. But the Russia of today is not the Russia of 2012. Almost all nations need to review their strategic assumptions and their strategic postures. And this will be more vital if Russia is allowed to win its invasion of Ukraine. A Russian victory will embolden Russia
and embolden other nations too, like China. I say almost all nations need to reassess their strategic posture because at least one nation has already done this, Australia. Australia's Defense Strategic Update of 2020 clearly saw that something threatening had changed in the approach of some major powers, including China. The China of today is not the China of 2012. And just as the Russia of today is not the Russia of 2012. Australia is perhaps the first nation to have formally altered its strategic military posture, including its procurement program, to respond to the evidence we all see, but few consider it plausible until Russia invaded Ukraine. Australia is changing from conventional to nuclear submarines, not because it is sure it won't need to use them, but because you have assessed that you might have to. And you are changing your inventory to include long-range strike missiles, not because you are sure you won't need to use them, but because you think you might. And Australia took this and many other strategic and operational steps 2 years ago and before almost all other nations. Now it is time for other nations to follow Australia's lead. And it's so often the case when Australia acts according to its long-held principles and values. The world, and Ukraine in particular, needs Australia's example and Australia's influence if we, all of us, are to preserve the sovereign community of independent nations that we have come to expect as a normal state of the world. We need the US, the EU, to act in the roles that they have established over many decades, to be guarantors of global security norms wherever they are threatened. We need the US to remain a credible and reliable source for stability and freedom from coercion, including as a credible strategic nuclear deterrent. We must stand against the threat that Russia made to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, a threat that directly challenges the core principles of the nuclear weapons non-proliferation framework. And we need to reinforce the global rights of nations to self-defense, including to join collective security arrangements. They feel the need to preserve their sovereignty and independence. Nations should not face invasion as a response to their efforts to protect their own security through lawful and legitimate means. I often get this question, do you think Russia invaded Ukraine because you intended to join NATO and NATO has expanded to the east? And I always say, I think Russia invaded Ukraine because NATO expanded to the east too slow. Because if Ukraine got a membership action plan in 2008 at the Bucharest summit, and we would have joined 3 years later, this invasion would never happen. The only reason Russia did not want Ukraine to join NATO is that they would lose a chance to invade Ukraine. So that was all about the invasion they had in mind for a long time. And we need to, those who study Russia, they know what the thinking of Putin was, how it all evolved. But back in 2007 in the Munich Security Conference, Vladimir Putin was very clear when he talked to Bush and others. He said, Ukraine is not a nation. It's a mistake on the map. Nobody heard him. He was really serious about that. Everybody was like, come on, Vlad, you're probably mad. But Vlad is not mad. Vlad is serious. Vlad is doing what he wants to do. He's on a mission. So it's all very important that so we need to reinforce the global rights of nations to self-defense, including to join collective security arrangements. They feel, they need to preserve their sovereignty and independence. I hope I have demonstrated to you today that Russia's invasion of Ukraine is not a geostrategic challenge for Europe and the US, which is only of casual interest to Australia. However, much Australia, quite rightly, will focus on the Indo-Pacific. This much is true. Australia's Indo-Pacific focus will become immeasurably more difficult and more threatening to Australia's regional security aspirations and environment if Russia wins in Ukraine. What happens in Ukraine will directly affect Australia's regional security environment. If Russia loses its military invasion of Ukraine, then the reputation and reliability of global collective action will be reinforced, and it will be a victory for principles and values that will stand for a generation. But if Russia wins, then the hybrid or gray zone tactics Australia sees in the Indo-Pacific will well transition to open regional hostilities in one form or another. Ukraine may be 15,000 kilometers away from Australia, but the outcome of the war, one way or another, will show up in your backyard sooner rather than later. It is in Australia's national interest that Ukraine wins against Russia. It has been and it remains in Australia's national interest to continue to assist Ukraine with practical support for its defense. It's been a long journey for me and my family since I arrived here. But let me tell you one thing. Yesterday, I spoke to a gathering of 1,000 people, and that was probably the largest audience I've ever had in my life. That was the annual meeting of the local governments. And I was there on stage, and that was just the experience of talking to people, the councillors, the mayors from all over the country. And let me tell you, I was so amazed by how much support I felt. And I tell them one thing. Australia is now in the news in Ukraine all the time for one reason, because Australian people are sending support. They're out there. All I do, I go on Ukrainian television every time there is more support coming from Australia, and they tell them, look, Australia is sending more weapons. Australia is sending Bushmasters. Australia is sending the guns we need. Australia is sending humanitarian assistance. And then all of a sudden, for the past 3 months, everybody is hearing about Australia. To kind of prevent the question I'm going to get anyways, I'm going to say that your prime minister is going to Madrid for the NATO summit. And I'm sure my president would be delighted to host him if he decides to come. I think that was send a very strong message of solidarity with Ukraine. Also, it will be the first historic visit of a prime minister of Australia to Ukraine. Following the footsteps of President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, and Draghi from Italy last week, that was unprecedented. For the students of international relations, getting the leaders of the 3 most powerful European nations, getting on the train and traveling to see the president of my country, this is unheard of. That never happened in history. Boris Johnson came next day for the 3rd time as the prime minister, for the 2nd time since the outbreak of the war. I think the world sees what's there, but what we need to have the constant supply of weapons and guns that we need to repel the Russians from the territory of Ukraine. That's the only way how we can restore the sovereignty of the country, which will eventually lead one day to a peace treaty, because all wars end with a peace treaty. But we can be discussing peace only when Russians leave Ukraine, when they leave Crimea, we restore our sovereignty in the borders recognized by everybody from 1991, and that's when we can talk peace. Because now forcing Ukraine into a peace deal is the worst thing that can happen. Because the only thing that is going to allow the Russians is to regroup, resupply, and attack Ukraine again. Russia has been attacking Ukraine for the past 300 years. This is nothing new to the students of history. We were not surprised Ukraine invaded Ukraine 8 years ago. We knew it was coming. My grandfather, who passed away 10 years ago, I remember he was always fighting for Ukraine's independence. And he was from Western Ukraine, and he hated the Soviets. And when Ukraine became independent, he said, wow, it's unbelievable. All my life, I had my relatives killed because they were fighting for Ukraine. And I cannot believe that it actually happened. And he said, I think the big war will come because Russians will not let us go like that. And it was sometime in 1991 when he said it. He actually said it at the times of a coup, a potential coup in the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev was kept in his dacha in Foros. That was his words, my grandfather who said it. He passed away in 2010, and he didn't see this war coming. But I still remember those words, and I was really amazed. How could he have predicted that? He was born in 1921. So he was born in Poland, then lived all his life in the Soviet Union. That part of Ukraine was part of Poland at the time. And then he died in independent Ukraine. For Ukrainian community here in Australia, and there are 40,000 Ukrainians here, it's always been an existential fight for Ukraine's independence. Just like for any community, Lithuanian community, Croatian community, Polish community, all those who were in emigration, hoping that Warsaw Pact would collapse one day, the Soviet Union would collapse that day. And after the Second World War, all these people were fighting for that independence of their nations. And then, of course, when Soviet Union collapsed, nobody predicted that it collapsed. It was something that nobody expected. But it did happen. And nobody expected that Russians would invade Ukraine, but they did. Look, there's so much to talk about. We have a great lineup of speakers. We've got Natasha Kuhrt, professor from King's College, and I was a student at the LSE. There was always this rivalry with the Kings. I was never part of it because I never played rugby, but I kind of watched that competition coming. I always had many friends from King's College, from the War Studies Institute, because I studied international relations and international trade there. So I'm happy we have her, and we have Anthony Galloway. Last time I spoke here, he was here in the room. Now I can see a Ukrainian church out there. I'm not sure if it's Orthodox or Catholic there, but Anthony will tell you which church is that on his background. It's good to have him. So I'm done with my remarks, and we can just listen to our panelists. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Ambassador Myroshnychenko. I'm glad you had a bit of emotion in your speech. You made me a bit emotional too, I have to say. I think it reminds everyone that we can't deny that war involves humans, and what we're watching here is a human tragedy. Some very clear messages from you in your address. Thank you. There's a global responsibility to act for the good of all, and two kinds of states, some that do that and some that don't. You asked an excellent question. What is the world going to do? So that's what I'd like to delve into a little bit more with our panelists. And good morning, I guess, to Natasha in London. Thanks for joining me. And Anthony as well. Hi. I might start with a question to you, Natasha, if I may. In your view, what do you think have been the key considerations that are shaping the political decisions in Europe, in the US and the UK, in terms of their support to Ukraine's fight against the Russian invasion?
Okay. Well, I think, the main factors would be really trying to, I suppose it's a balancing act between pressure to maybe put boots on the ground and, the kind of moral imperative to continue to supply weaponry to Ukraine. And obviously we've seen that being an issue, particularly in the case of Germany, where, if you like, historical factors have sort of returned, if you like, and kind of, highlighted, I guess, Germany's kind of, if you like, Germany has kind of had to step up to the plate in a way that it's very hesitant to do that, to kind of take on the mantle, if you like, of a leading power in Europe, because, of course, previously there's been a lot of criticism of Germany, sort of a lot of anxiety, if you like, around the idea of Germany, being that centre of gravity in Europe, and particularly in Central Europe, given the history there. And so I guess it's different for different countries in Europe, although I think we can see that, the European Union is coming together in a way that perhaps it hasn't done for quite some time. There are still, of course, issues around countries like Hungary and so on. But Ursula von der Leyen, for example, has been very clear, I think, about, the European Union as an institution, the European Union's commitment to Ukraine. And then in the United States, I guess, again, I don't think anyone wants the US to have to be in the position of sending troops into Ukraine. So I suppose it's a question of how long you can keep the public on side. Clearly, there are different considerations in Europe because of the energy issue, which doesn't really come into play in the case of the United States. So there is a huge amount of goodwill towards Ukraine and a huge amount of support there. But I think, as we know, when it comes to the winter, if we haven't weaned ourselves off Russian energy supplies sufficiently. I mean, we have already begun to do that, but it's still there. We're still dependent on it to a greater or lesser extent, depending on the country. But that's going to be critical, I think, when we get to winter, and then things are beginning to, depending on how the war is going as well.
Anthony, can I turn to you? You're obviously in Ukraine. Can you describe what you've seen of the impact of the war on the Ukrainian people? Can you talk a little bit, please, to the human face of the war, and perhaps to some of the things that have surprised or even impressed you the most?
Yeah, sure. Well, for starters, I'm standing in a village that I couldn't have been standing in just a few months ago when I was here in March. It was Russian occupied. So the amount of places that I've been able to travel through the past week and a half while I've been in Ukraine has been not surprising, but has been very welcome. It's a much easier place to get around in places like Kyiv, central Ukraine, western Ukraine. People are doing a lot better in terms of just trying to get on with life as best they can. In some ways, it's surreal, right? Like, people are in beer gardens drinking beer. It's summer. That they're trying to get on with life in large parts of the country. Having said that, I've just been in the Donbas region in the east for the past week. Days on the front line there, and it's more perilous there than it was when I was here in March, because that's the focus of Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine at the moment. And the soldiers there are really feeling it. They're losing a large number of their comrades, and that kind of adrenaline fueled feeling that they had in the opening weeks of the invasion has probably turned into a understanding that this is going to be a long, drawn out conflict. They're not completely depleted. They're not they think they will win, but they are resigned to the fact that this will be a long, drawn out conflict. In terms of the people, I mean, like I was saying, it's really a tale of two Ukraines at the moment. The Donbas is just full of hollowed out cities. If we're talking about Slavyansk, that's a city normally of 100,000 people. It's 30,000 people at the moment. I was in Lysychansk, which is just across the river from Severodonetsk. That's just a bombed out wasteland, a few thousand people left. No power, electricity or water. The civilians there say they're literally dying of hunger. So that's a world away from Kyiv at the moment. So, the world's attention still needs to be on Ukraine, just because places like Kyiv aren't under attack every single day. Other places are.
Thank you. Look, we've seen, I think, a blatant disregard, and you talked to this, Ambassador, of the United Nations Charter. We've seen atrocities, a growing list of dehumanising actions, including forced deportations of children. These are increasingly known and they're documented. What does Russia's illegal invasion of a sovereign country mean for accountability under international law and the UN system? Perhaps one for you, Natasha.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we have developed, quite strong accountability mechanisms. Obviously, the International Criminal Court being the principal mechanism. We didn't have that during the Yugoslav wars, although for Yugoslavia, we had a special tribunal which was set up under Chapter 7, right? So it had particular powers. The International Criminal Court, of course, is a court of last resort. It's a court that steps in, if countries are unwilling or unable to prosecute. Russia was a signatory to the International Criminal Court. It no longer is. Ukraine is not a signatory, but it has agreed to cooperate with the court, and we have, it's growing all the time, but a very large number of member states, of state parties to the Treaty of Rome have now referred the case to the court, the case of Russia-Ukraine. And we also have the ICJ, but the court that might actually be able to do something is the ICC. Unfortunately, obviously, it doesn't have a police force. So we're reliant on, those who have been indicted being apprehended in some way and brought to the court. So that would be the major problem. We don't have a problem in terms of, the mechanisms. We just have a problem in terms of, the enforcement of any kind of ruling, if you like. So the accountability mechanism is there, but the problem would be how to actually bring Putin or whoever is indicted by the court to that court.
Well, I can just add on the issue of international public law. The problem with international public law is that it's not enforceable, and we all understand it, right? Of course, once you go through the system, you can probably do it, and we've seen it with the case with the indictment of the military leaders from the Balkan Wars. But in the case of Russia, it's impossible. Well, firstly, Russia is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which we question that. Nobody voted for that. When the Soviet Union collapsed, who decided that it's going to be Russia on the seat? As I mentioned, Ukraine is one of the founding member states of the UN. And for some reason, they ended up there in that seat and nobody kind of talked about it. I think that should be a discussion for international lawyers about the legitimacy of this. And actually, that would probably help to overhaul the whole UN system, which is often not that efficient because it was designed in 1945 and we live in a different world. And there are other nations which probably deserve to be on that permanent member seat, like Germany, like Japan, like India. But we now live in a different world, right? It's all changed. So that's important to understand it. But you think there are so many limits to international law, and unfortunately, it's out of reach for us to influence Russia in any way possible way, in the meaningful way. Of course, we understand the value of the system, rule-based system, right, which is supposed to be rule-based, but Russia has violated all possible conventions that you can imagine, bilateral treaties, international conventions, UN Charter, everything, right? Well, of course, we can condemn it, and all these resolutions we get in the UN, they are crucial for us, especially in all these legal proceedings, which will be forthcoming. But it'll take years and years and years. And how many more Ukrainians going to get killed? How many more Ukrainian women going to get raped? How many Ukrainian children going to get killed? How many? If Russia continues selling its gas and oil, they can continue this war for another 2 years or 3 years. They can do it. We can't. We need to get a steady supply of weapons into Ukraine. We need multiple rocket launchers. We need long-range missiles. We need anti-tank. We need infantry fighting vehicles. We need fighting drones. We need reconnaissance drones. We need the weapons and ammunition, 155mm ammunition. Just give you one example. Australia was gracious to provide the howitzer guns, these artillery pieces, 6 of those. When I was in Kyiv the other week, and I was there for a week, and actually share Anthony's impression of Kyiv. Kyiv looks bizarre because it's nice and people are having fun. And then, you wake up and then there is a missile which just hit the place, which was just 7 kilometers from my flat. But nobody seems to care. Nobody's running to a shelter anymore. So everybody kind of accepted, well, you can get killed, but that's life, right? But I met Minister of Defense, I met top military people there in Ukraine when I was in Kyiv. They told me, look, with this artillery pieces, we now have 120 of the NATO standard artillery guns, like 777 howitzer guns, and we need 830 of those. Australia currently provided 6. So where would we get the other guns? We need them badly. And we need long-range missiles over 150 kilometers because we can't reach Russians with shorter range. We need tanks, real tanks. I mean, Bushmasters are good, but they're not for fighting. They are for transporting people out from the battlefield and supply and also the ambulance, which works this way.
The same for M113. We can make use of those as well. And Australia has provided 14 of those. They're good. But again, they're not fighting. They're for personnel transport. But we need real tanks. We need jets. Can we get the jets? And the jets is the biggest issue, right? We need F-16s, we need F-35s. We've been asking for that for a long time. We've been asking for a no-fly zone. It never happened. But maybe something will change. And maybe it will come. So instead of discussing international law, which is of course very important, I believe it's very important that we discuss the steady supply of weapons into Ukraine. And only when and once we repel the Russians, we can talk about international law, we can talk about peace. And then of course, we'll have to talk about the reconstruction of the country. And this is where Australia could really contribute. Come with the infrastructure money, infrastructure institutional investors who can come. I already told this story many times. When I pitched myself to the president, because I'm politically appointed, I'm a grassroots ambassador, as I call myself. I was never part of the civil service, never part of the government. I was part of business, and I was part of civil society. And I pitched it to my president, said, appoint me as an ambassador to Australia because I want to promote trade and investment. This is what I've been doing for the past 20 years. And he said, yes, sounds like a good idea. And it all started back in December. But now I spend most of the time talking to military people and to DOD and whatnot, coming to military bases. I was never trained to do that, though I'm a reserve lieutenant, because at the university, we have this training for 2 years, and I was trained as a military interpreter, apart from studying international relations, but this is part of the drill, right? You become a reserve lieutenant. Luckily, I was there in those classes. I didn't miss them, so it helped me a lot with this NATO, what is called, how do you say that? NATO jargon, right?
Yeah.
Good, anyways.
Excellent. No, thank you. Excellent. Nice segue. Actually, Anthony, you've written a piece that was published today on the Bushmasters, and I do encourage everyone to read that piece. I want to ask you, we've heard very clearly from the ambassador now what he thinks we need. What is your sense? What are people telling you about the difference, if any, that foreign assistance is making? What are the perceptions on the ground of foreign support, and what is needed now and into the future? And I acknowledge you've already said attention, focus, and to stay tuned in. But can you complement what we've just heard from the ambassador?
What the ambassador just said is very similar to what every soldier will tell you on the ground. Things like Bushmasters are great; they have proved their worth, but they are for transporting soldiers to and from the front line. They're not for advancing forward. They want different types of capabilities. And it's not to say that the West isn't sending Ukraine the types of capabilities they need, but they will all say they're not coming fast enough. My assessment is the kind of asymmetrical advantages that Ukraine had in the early weeks of the invasion, when Russia was focused on taking cities like Kyiv and Kharkiv, don't necessarily exist in a region such as the Donbass. We're talking about large open fields. So as the ambassador alluded to before, long-range missiles, anti-air capabilities are really things that soldiers are talking about. Heavy artillery, more tanks. Those are the types of things that you need in that type of terrain where you're not dealing with big cities. Yes, you're dealing with cities that used to be 100,000 people, but as I said before, they are hollowed out cities. They don't have nearly as many civilians left in them. So we're talking about very different capabilities that they need, and every soldier on the ground will tell you they're not coming quick enough. I would question Australia. Why aren't we sending some of our tanks? We're spending billions of dollars on new tanks over the next decade or so. I can't think of a war that we're going to personally be needing our current tanks for in the next few years. Why aren't we sending tanks? I think that is a question for our government.
So thank you so much. Look, Natasha, I might come back to you. What are your observations on and the possible futures of Russia-China relations and the broader geopolitical lessons that should be learned from this crisis? The ambassador talked about there being those two different types of states and the responsibilities upon states. Can you comment on the Russia-China relationship and those angles for us?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think we have not really been paying enough attention to the Russia-China relationship, which, by the way, has been evolving since 1989, when Gorbachev already reached out to China because of the need to demarcate the border. So it's not something that just happened in 2014. Yeah, the Russia-China relationship, I mean, essentially, China takes this position of kind of studied neutrality. It calls it, Chinese academics will tell you it's an independent position. They don't like this word neutral. They don't like to be depicted as sitting on the fence, but obviously that's actually what they're doing. For China, this is clearly a very critical moment in time because it's in a very delicate kind of position at the moment vis-a-vis the United States. And its future relationship with the United States and also to some extent Europe. I think that China will do its best to continue to gain what it can economically from Russia, as it's doing with the cheap oil. I think it will do what it can to essentially not actively support Russia in the tip. I don't think it will supply any equipment to Russia and so on, but it will extract what it can. And China very clearly sees this as a proxy war with the West. So I think we need to be clear that China does have a very different view of this war. And so you could almost see Russia as, a kind of stand-in for China, if you like. So Russia can essentially do the job for China, if Russia is victorious over Ukraine, which, essentially means a victory over the West, then that would be actually of benefit to China. But obviously, China is also very worried that Russia might lose this war. And, if you're backing the wrong horse, then that's not going to be good in the longer term for China. So China will probably see which way the wind is blowing. I mean, China obviously does have important trade with Europe. At the same time, there's this Taiwan angle. I mean, I personally think, any invasion of Taiwan is going to be quite some time in the future. And obviously, geopolitically, geostrategically, it's very different to Ukraine. But clearly, China has been very taken aback by the kind of unity of the West. It certainly, I think, is very, very surprised by that and was not expecting that at all. And as we know, Biden called for more transatlantic unity and so on, but it was unclear whether this was actually going to materialize. So definitely China is very concerned about this unity because it's a kind of proxy for how the West might react were China to intervene in Taiwan. So essentially I think China will keep kind of to one side, if you like, and it will continue to extract what it can from this war.
Thank you. Some very important observations there, and a reminder of the relevance again of what's happening in Europe for our own region. Anthony, I do want to leave some time for questions from the audience, so I'll try and make this my last. But did you want to offer any personal reflections as an Australian on why and how this crisis matters for us back here in Australia and our region?
The average Ukrainian will say it does, just as fellow democracies. They both soldiers and civilians here talk about the precedent that's set by allowing Russia to again annex or invade large parts of Ukraine. They will say time and time again that we need to win this. We need to win the war this time. They keep referring to 2014, where as they see it, the world, the West, countries like Australia, we put a few sanctions on Russia, but they really see it as the world letting Putin annex the Crimea and invade the Donbass back then, and they got away with it. So they really think any talk of peace talks now are ridiculous, because I mean, how can you go to the table when they control basically all of the Luhansk region, so a lot more of the Donbass than they did prior to February 24 this year. How can you go to the table now? They say there's a lot more fighting to do before we talk about peace talks. And that they're always talking about the precedent that's set for fellow democracies. So they see countries like this conflict as being deeply relevant to countries like Australia.
By the way, if I can talk a little bit about China, because when I was in London, I studied international political economy. So China was a big case in 2005, which was very important from a standpoint of international political economy. That was when China unilaterally locked in the liberal reforms, economic reforms, and joined WTO, World Trade Organization, in 2001. So that was a casebook study for many to look at how good China was in liberalizing the economy, attracting billions and billions of dollars, and actually overcoming poverty in China. It's a phenomenal story, I think, from an economic point of view. And the relations between Russia and China have to be actually looked at from the angle of business and trade and investment, apart from, of course, security issues and geopolitics. But I think a lot of people in discussing geopolitics or security and defense, they don't look at business and finance, which I think is extremely, extremely important to understand. You see, currently, Russia is only 1/8 of the Chinese economy. So in the Soviet times, the relationship, well, between Soviet Union and China was different. Also for the reasons of the size of the economy. So today, Russia is important for China as a source of fossil fuels and commodities, minerals, whatever they can get out of Russia. And of course, now a lot depends on Russia, because a lot depends on China in Russia. Because pretty much if China is siding with Russia, Russians can go on forever with all the sanctions imposed by the West. Because unless we have a full embargo on oil, gas, and coal, Russians can wage this war for a long time. And you see now it's different. Now China is kind of understands it. But we also have to look at Chinese economy, because China's trade with America, with Europe, with Australia, with other countries, Western countries, is more important to China than it is for Russia. China is the biggest investor in the US government bonds. US is the biggest importer of Chinese products. So it's actually an interdependency between these two countries. And of course, they are now in the global rivalry from a standpoint of geopolitics. But look, at the end of the day, they depend on each other, because Russians invest in the American debt. Americans have money to buy Chinese products, and China needs it. As simple as that. Of course, now there's a Russian invasion of Ukraine. It all changed. We now got a different dynamic. But at the end of the day, we are talking about how many people in China? 1.5 billion? I'm sorry. Yeah, and the population is growing. So these people need food. They need to eat. Ukraine was one of the biggest suppliers of grain and wheat in the world. We're actually number 5 in the world. We're the largest exporter of sunflower oil in the world. Many countries depend on those commodities to survive. The prices for bread in Chad have tripled. People are starving in Africa because they can't get a hold of the Ukrainian grain. We are suffocating because 70% of our export goes from Black Sea ports. And now with Russian Navy there, we can't do it. Whatever we can export through by trucks and trains, by Danube River, is a fraction of what we need in terms of the volume. A new harvest is coming now in July and August. Well, for wheat, it's in July. For corn, it's a little bit later. We don't have where to store this.
All our grain storage facilities are packed. Last year, our yield was 110 million tons of grain. Very good yield, very good harvest. This year, we are predicting around 70 million tons of grain. Our grain storage facilities are only for 50 million tons of grain. Because usually when you have a normal cycle, you just sell it, you take it to the ports, you take it to the global market. We can't do it now. So now what do? We burn that grain. What do we do? Russians keep on looting it in Kherson, in Mykolaiv. They just steal it and they sell it to other countries, to Syria and others, right? They've been stealing our agriculture equipment. They've been destroying our grain storage facilities. And they are the key country to blame for this famine, which is already there in the Middle East and Africa. So it's very important that we all understand why it is. The prices for petrol, the prices for energy, the electricity bills. When was the last time you saw the bill? I'm paying now, the local bills. I got a message that prices have increased. One reason for that is Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's very important that this cost of living debate here in this country is clearly understood by the Australian people, that there is one country to blame, and it's Russia. By helping Ukraine to repel the Russians, Australian government is helping Australian people. As simple as that.
I know that Natasha probably has more to add on the food and the fuel security issues, but I do need to open the floor. There's a roving mic. Please put your hand up if you have a question. Please identify yourself and where you're from. And if your question is for a particular member of our panel or the ambassador, please identify that. Thank you.
Yeah, g'day, Jared Thompson. Natasha, I just wanted to ask you a question about something you mentioned earlier, that the Chinese were perhaps surprised by the unity of the West. And, there's probably the notable exception in NATO and the EU of Hungary. And I think Viktor Orban was re-elected fairly recently, and after his re-election, he said that he didn't just defeat his political opponents in Hungary, but he also had to defeat the EU, NATO, and Ukraine because he felt that everyone ganged up against him in Europe and the West. Do you think there is perhaps a collective amnesia in Hungary about 1956 and their own experience with Russian aggression?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, actually, I was in Budapest a few weeks ago for a workshop on nationalism, appropriately. I mean, Orban, he plays to the gallery. He is a sort of a real populist leader. And in terms of amnesia, he certainly suffers from amnesia himself, because he actually did an MA, I think it was, with the support of the Soros Foundation, which of course, is one of his targets these days. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing still in Hungary if you go to their National History Museum and so on. But they are playing around with history. It's quite clear. You can see, that also in terms of the Second World War and so on, Hungarians are painted as victims. And so I think there is very much a kind of victim mentality, as far as I can see, in Hungary, and 1956 is part of that. But I mean, I would say don't expect populist leaders to be consistent or logical. I mean, we can look at Trump, there's no logic to it. That's not the point, right? It's about playing to the gallery. And you're right, yes. I mean, of course, they should, they're certainly very much against, communism, Soviet Union and so on. But, they need this energy. This isn't me kind of forgiving Hungary, Orban, but it's very much more difficult for Hungary to find alternative sources of energy than it is for certain other countries, which doesn't make it right. Okay, but it's a problem, that of course should have been addressed some time ago so that they wouldn't find themselves in this position. So that's really what it boils down to.
Thank you. Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. A question for Anthony Galloway. Anthony, good to see you on the ground over there. This is actually a question, particularly if any Russians are listening. Have you found any Nazis over there?
G'day, Kim. No, I haven't. It's the Nazi element is something that everyone jokes about here. I mean, it's none of that's to say that there aren't isolated elements in Ukraine of the far right, just like in any country, just like in any European country. And it's not to say that, you know, some areas of the military, especially in those early years post 2014, such as the Azov Battalion, didn't have some concerning far right connections. But the Ukrainian government has done a lot to address that and root that out. And no, I haven't met any Nazis so far. I've had 2 trips to Ukraine in the past few months, and no Nazis yet.
John Richardson, ex-DFAT, including in Moscow. Perhaps for the ambassador, firstly, if I'm allowed a quick comment on the question of international law and criminal tribunals, I wouldn't underestimate not the enforceability, but the practical impact. If you are indicted by the ICC, like Omar al-Bashir of Sudan, or previously Milosevic with the Yugoslav tribunal, it creates all sorts of practical and political problems for you to participate in international organisations and events and travel. So that would be a question. And I'm sure Mr. Putin has Mr. Milosevic somewhere at the back of his mind, like he has Gaddafi as well, as sort of as a ghost that lurks. But on the question of sanctions, Ambassador, do you feel that the international community, including Australia, could do more in relation to sanctions? And on a more difficult level I guess, for Ukraine, is there more pressure that some countries should be putting on others that are much more sitting on the fence, particularly in developing countries, to take a harder line on Russia? An example might be the G20 in Indonesia, which is obviously a difficult one for somewhere like Australia to talk about Putin participating.
Thank you very much for your question. I totally agree with you. I didn't mean to downgrade the value of international court system. That totally makes sense. And it's just long term, it takes more time, but I'm sure we need to do it. We need to do everything properly according to all different legal mechanisms which are out there in international public law, that we can prosecute the culprits and get them indicted and maybe sentenced as well. I mean, and have the justice done. Speaking of sanctions, I think Australia is a paragon, and I hope many more countries follow the example. Australia was out there with a full embargo on the Russian gas, oil, and coal. Maybe it was easy for Australia because they didn't buy much of that either. I think there was a little bit of oil, but that's it. So it was easy for Australia, but we really highly appreciate it. And what was more important is actually tariffs on all the products from Belarus and Russia, 35% tariff, which actually made all their products uncompetitive. The ban of alumina, I think that was a big hit. 20% of alumina in Russia comes from Australia. And for Vasyl and all these oligarchs in Russia, it was painful. We need to block Russian ships into the ports, it's still coming. We need to get all Australian companies out of Russia. Let me give you an example. Canva. Do you know what is Canva? Raise your hand if you know what is Canva. Okay, it's an Australian company, design marketing company, which gives you an opportunity. My daughter does all my social media for the embassy, and she uses Canva. She's been using Canva for a long time, actually, 3 or 5 years. She was always telling me about Canva. I never knew about the company. Oh, Canva is so good. You can do those beautiful presentations. And then I learned that Canva is actually an Australian company. And they've had 1.5 million users in Russia. And I was so delighted after the conversation I had with Canva 2 or 3 weeks ago. Actually, I was in Kiev that time in early June. It was end of May, and I had a conversation with their co-founder, and I told him the story of Ukraine, and he said, "I get it. I'm out of Russia." So Canva stopped. They lost a huge source of revenue from 1.5 million users of Canva in Russia. And I want to encourage all those companies who still continue doing their business in Russia, and there are many Australian companies who still do, many companies who are in the mining industry, servicing extraction of minerals in Russia, they're Australian, just because of their expertise and the capabilities. And I really encourage you to consider coming, because I will be public about that. I will name and shame. I will talk about this. I don't want to do it now, but I think it's not a threat. It's just reality. I don't think any money which is being made in Russia now is all blood money. One prominent Australian, Andrew Forrest, he went on Bloomberg on the second day of war, and he said all companies doing business in Russia are blood money. It was second or third day of war at the end of February. It was very courageous. But what Andrew Forrest has demonstrated to Australia and to the world, he divested from Russia. He had investments in Russia. He left Russia. I hear that there's these companies in the timber industry, and there are 2 major companies in Australia who are producing equipment for the cut of timber, and Russia's export of timber per year is $12 billion. And they rely on the Australian equipment. I want to see those companies leaving the market. I hope they've done it. If not, I hope they follow up. They stop selling that equipment to the Russians. I hear that there is a company which is in management strategy consulting, Australian, specializing on the mining and oil and gas sectors. I won't name it now, but everybody knows the company here in Australia in management strategy consulting who are doing that. I want them to stop doing it because they help the Russian kleptocrats who've stolen this money from the Russian people. They are only the owners of these assets because they're close to Putin. And they are helping them to increase their efficiency. So their companies can make more money, to buy more, pay higher taxes in Russia. And with that money, Russians buy weapons, develop weapons, and kill Ukrainians. I think it needs to stop. So you see this whole thing, and speaking of, there was a question, if I can comment on that, on Hungary. Because, well, that's a question we always get. And I know many Hungarian people from Hungary, and many of my friends, Ukrainians, are of Hungarian background, because we have a very vibrant Hungarian community. And most of them live in Zakarpattia, which is a place in southwestern part of Ukraine, which has this mixed history. You know, that part of Ukraine was part of different nations. So there is this joke about a man who was born in Austria-Hungary. Then he went to school in Czechoslovakia. Then he graduated and got married when in Hungary. And then he spent his life in the Soviet Union. And then he died in Ukraine. And that man never left his village. So all his life he was living in the same village. But there was a very tumultuous history in that part of Ukraine. And there is a community, Hungarian community. Hungarian community lives in all the neighboring countries next to Hungary, in Slovakia, and in Romania, and others. So it's very vibrant, and we have very good relations with Hungarian people. You know, so but the thing is that, you know, that's the problem of the EU. I don't know. We have actually several ambassadors here. We got Lithuanian ambassador. We get French ambassador. Do we have any other ambassadors in the room? I'm just very curious, and maybe you can answer that. So when was it when Hungary joined the EU, right? And you were there making decisions, right, with Germans, and now, you know, it all has kind of evolved now. And you have these inclinations to kind of authoritarian kind of rule. It's not yet authoritarian, of course, because we have only one dictator in Europe, and it's Vladimir Putin. But I'm just curious. So you're now part of NATO, part of EU, and then what do you do with that? Isn't it a threat to the EU, to the unity of the EU? Oh, it's mostly for my French friend, of course, but I'm sure the Lithuanian friend has his own ideas on this. What do you think? What do we do?
Maybe we could get a mic from the French ambassador, please.
I admire what you do. You're absolutely right. And that's a question for the EU. At a time where we need absolute unity and a strong stand in favor of Ukraine. And it's not because we choose a side, it's just because it happens that Ukraine has been unlawfully, without any reason, and attacked, and nothing can justify that. So EU support has been, as mentioned before, extremely strong. And but yes, there are sometimes some dissenting voices, and that is a question that we need to address within the EU. It's no secret that there have been, even before Ukraine, quite a lot of discussions about some actions which were taken, not related to Ukraine, but related to some internal questions around values. It was not only about Hungary, by the way, but values which are essential for the functioning of the EU, liberal values, values of respect for the independence of justice, values related to the independence of press. And yes, some countries have been maybe not always following. There was even a question of internal EU sanctions, withdrawing or withholding funds from the EU to some of the countries which were not respecting the values of the EU. So it is sad that it happened at the moment where unity would be paramount. It is sad that it happened especially towards a neighboring country like Ukraine for Hungary, because what happens today to Ukraine, who knows what will happen next if it is not only contained, but also rolled back. So it's a question of our survival for all of us. And beyond that, I would like to also stress once again here in Australia, it's not a question about Ukraine, even if there are many reasons to support Ukraine. It's a question for the world. It's a question of how can we all survive in peace if we are not reacting, if we are not countering unilateral actions by big countries towards smaller ones. This, we know, can replicate anywhere. So actions that have been taken by Australia, actions that have been taken by the large majority of the countries in the world. And from this point of view, I would like to stress also one point. The Pacific countries' unity in support of the initial statements of the UN on Ukraine have been incredibly strong, because those countries on the other side of the world, could have also considered, like sometimes others, that it is not their business. But they did take a stand. And I think it's also important why we are here to remember that Australia can have a role on this issue also by continuing together with partners like France, like the US and others, to make the point that what happened in Ukraine is not a Western issue. What happened in Ukraine is a question of value for all of us. It's a question of precedent. It's a question not only of decency, because what happened on the ground that Anthony, for example, was testifying about is something that could happen anywhere if there are no more rules and if one actor can decide unilaterally to invade another country, because he can and can afford it. So you're absolutely right. And from this point of view, back to the point you mentioned, it's sad that within the EU there are some resistance, but we work on it and we hope that it will, with time passing, being solved.
Maybe the Lithuanian ambassador could comment. You can comment on any question you want. I'm sure you get Darius, who is the Lithuanian ambassador, who just arrived 4 months before me. So we're kind of newcomers here.
So, well, first of all, the French presidency of the European Union, absolutely, you are right of what you have been telling to us, to all of us. Well, I wouldn't be able to reflect on something, because you've been dealing and you've been talking to us, I think, excellently. And what I was talking, a couple of days ago in Melbourne about Ukraine. Yeah. I was talking about China, and certainly, well, we are part of you in a way, part of you. So you probably know that a couple of weeks ago we crowdfunded our nation, from the small kindergarten kid to the retired pensioners. They donated, I don't know, from €5 to many thousand euros, and we founded the combat drone, and we bought it from Turkey. by Bayraktar. So, and we got actually on Australian, so $8 million. So that's amazing for 3 days. For 3 days, all the people.
Crowdfunding in 3 days, $8 million to buy a fighting drone from Turkey. And in 3 days in crowdfunding. Amazing story. That was just phenomenal.
Yeah. And well, you know, because our people, sorry, they don't like the other guy. Sorry about that, because, you know, we've been occupied for 80 years probably. So, but in any case, also, you know, when Hungary was mentioned, I would also reflect, I'm not going to mention that name because already mentioned, about Swedish and Finnish membership of NATO. And certainly next week, there'll be NATO summit in Madrid. And I do hope there will be some discussion, but we understand that there is yet another NATO member state which is not willing to let the two countries to be part of NATO. So it's also quite interesting. I'm not sure about one of the populations in that particular country. I think it's a big issue between that particular country and Russia. What they do, what they're having, their own bilateral links, what the trade for that country. It's the largest trade market, tourism market, and of course 6 nuclear power plants which are built in Turkey. So I mentioned the name.
Look, thank you. Thank you for indulging us going a little over time. I acknowledge that we have. I hope you will stay and continue the conversation. But I feel like that's a really nice place for us to end the formalities. I thank you, Natasha and Anthony, for joining us. A really great and a really important conversation. We have some canapes and some drinks, so please stick around and continue to talk. And if you have further questions, please, there are many people here, I guess, who would like to answer them and can offer you some interesting views. Thank you for coming tonight, and that's the end of the formalities. Thank you.